Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the distant past. A soft-spoken tale brought to you by the Boring History Channel, where boring history becomes a gentle whisper to lull you into peace. Tonight, we invite you to settle in, breathe deeply, and lose yourself in a boring story, one carefully crafted for your bedtime relaxation. This is not history for excitement, but boring history for sleep. A space for calm, for reflection, and perhaps a yawn or two. This boring history video is made for the late hours, where dim candlelight flickers and the world fades to stillness. You're here because you know the comfort of falling asleep to boring history, the pleasure of soft storytelling, and the soothing embrace of a history sleep story that asks nothing more of you than to listen. Tonight's tale drifts back to a moment that is both unsettling and strangely timeless. The years of the Black Death, a period of sorrow and silence, yes, but also one of endurance. And tonight, we look not through the eyes of kings or generals, but through the soft-footed steps of children, in towns hushed by plague. Children still played. They whispered stories. They listened to the wind in the rafters and feared the shadows in the corners of their world. Our story will unfold in 4 gentle chapters. First, we'll slip into the rhythm of daily life, exploring what a child's day might look like in a medieval village gripped by dread. Then, we'll drift into a quiet biographical tale, not of a great hero, but of a small voice remembered faintly in the margins of history. From there, we'll move gently into a segment of mystery and culture, discovering the ghost stories, charms, and strange beliefs that shaped their fear and comforted their dreams. And finally, we'll rise into the world of the elite, where noble children learn Latin and manners, far removed from the dust of the fields, but never fully safe from the touch of plague. This is not a tale of gore or suffering, but one of shadows and silence. We'll hear the creak of old wooden floors, the quiet chant of nursery rhymes lost time, and the rustle of parchment pages in dim light, all with the soft hush of history's passing breath. So, if you're a boring history sleeper, a fan of relaxing history to fall asleep to, or simply a curious listener longing for a moment of stillness, this journey is yours. Close your eyes if you like, or simply let your mind drift. Let's begin our tale of how children lived, loved, and quietly endured during the long, slow shadow of the Black Plague. Imagine yourself in a quiet English village, sometime around the year 1349. The sky is low and gray, heavy with mist, and the thatched rooftops glisten faintly with dew. The village itself is hushed. There are fewer footsteps on the muddy paths than there used to be, and the morning songs of the birds are no longer echoed by the chatter of neighbors at their doors. Inside a modest wattle-end dog cottage, a small child stirs beneath a woolen blanket. The blanket is coarse, hand-woven, and warm from sheer body heat. Brothers and sisters often sleep side by side, bundled together like kittens to preserve warmth. The child wakes not to the sound of a bell or a rooster, but to the quiet rustling of their mother grinding oats in a stone mortar. There is no rush, only the steady rhythm of survival. Morning routines were modest, shaped by scarcity and necessity. A child might wash their face with cold water fetched from a nearby stream the day before, pour it carefully from a clay jug to conserve every drop. Soap was rare, a luxury if it existed at all. The water smelled faintly of moss. The cloth used to dab their cheeks rough from many washings and the harsh hands of lye. Breakfast, if there was any, might be a slice of coarse rye bread, sometimes stale, dipped in a thin gruel or warmed in the ashes of the hearth. Meat was a luxury seldom tasted. In some homes, parents would give children their portions and go without. Hunger was not a dramatic affair. It was a constant companion, more like a dull ache in the background than a sharp cry. For children, the morning brought chores. Not toys, not lessons, but small responsibilities handed down like heirlooms. They would feed the chickens, if any were left, gather eggs, if any were laid, sweep the dirt floor with a broom made from bundled twigs. Children fetch firewood from nearby woods, small arms hugging bundles of kindling, eyes worried for things real and imagined. Outside, the village paths were quieter now. Fewer neighbors passed by, fewer carts rolled through. Doors were shut and windows shuttered. The plague had come some weeks ago. Quietly at first, like a shadow passing across a sunlit field. Now, the village lived in a different rhythm. Slower, cautious, reverent, and fearful. But even in fear, life went on. A child might walk to a neighbor's home to deliver a message, carefully keeping distance. They were told not to touch, not to linger, not to breathe too deeply. They didn't fully understand why, only that something dark moved through the world, and it was important to be small, to be quiet, and to obey. Yet the day itself remained indifferent. The wind moved gently across the thatched roofs. Chickens clucked. The blacksmith's forge, if still active, clinked with faint hammers. Smoke curled from chimneys in hesitant threads. For a child, this was a world. Its ordinary rhythm marked by soft footsteps, whispered instructions, and a quiet expectation to survive one more day. By the time the pale sun has risen a little higher, burning away some of the mist, the village becomes, if only briefly, a place of mild movement again. The faint clatter of tools, the shuffling of feet, and the smell of cooking greens drift through the air. It is midday, though there are no clocks to chime the hour. Time, for most medieval villagers, is measured by light and shadow, by hunger and task, rather than by ticking hands. Children, once their chores are completed, may find time, brief, precious time, for play. But games in the 14th century were simple things. There were no dolls made in factories, no tin soldiers or carved horses painted with care. A favorite toy might be a cloth figure stuffed with straw, its features stitched in crooked lines, or a ball made of leather scraps sewn together, passed between friends with laughter too short-lived. Some children carved shapes from sticks, swords, animals, or people, while others played games with pebbles. A game not unlike jacks was played with small stones tossed into the air and caught on the back of the hand. The game required dexterity, but also helped pass the time, and more importantly, distracted young minds from the anxieties adults wore like cloaks. One favorite among village children was hoop rolling, using a stick to roll a wooden or metal hoop along the path, keep it upright with quick, practiced taps. The clattering rhythm of the hoop was oddly musical. Some older villagers frowned at the noise, while others smiled quietly, remembering their own days of childish racket before the world had grown heavier. The laughter was subdued now. Even in games, joy felt careful. Children still chased each other through fields of tall grass, less tended now, a little wild around the edges. They sang rhymes, often strange and old, their meanings long forgotten. Some of the songs mentioned death or sickness, without the children understanding why. Ring-a-ring, O roses, a tune still whispered centuries later, may or may not have had anything to do with the plague, but the echoes were there, fright and fun, twined together like the threads of their worn tunics. Meals, when available, were usually eaten around this time. Stew if they were lucky, turnips and beans if not. It was shared, often silently, sometimes in prayer. And when there wasn't enough, children were taught not to ask. They learned to eat slowly, to savor what little was warm and filling, and to leave the rest of the younger ones, the frail, the sick. Sometimes a neighbor might leave food at the door, a crust of bread, a cabbage, a kindness. Even the smallest village had its quiet caretakers. And still, amid simplicity of midday, the chores, the short play, the meager meal, children adapted. This was not strange to them. It was the only world they knew. The strange thing to them might be the way adults looked at the sky, or the way they whispered behind doors, or the way they clutched talismans and crossed themselves with sudden urgency. To a child, Midday was still a time of light, a time to run, to sing, to balance on stones across a stream, to be barefoot in the dust, even as fear gathered like thunderclouds just beyond the horizon. As the pale sun dipped behind the hills and the long shadows stretched like sleepy fingers across the village paths, the world began to grow quieter. The hush of evening during the plague years was different than the peaceful end of an ordinary day. It was deeper, more cautious. There was something in the silence, as though even the air itself was holding its breath. Children, after a long day of chores and brief moment of play, were ushered indoors. Doors were latched, shutters drawn. The cottage interior grew dim, lit only by a few sputtering tallow candles or the orange glow of the hearth. Smoke curled up to the thatch and into the darkening sky. Evening routines were gentle and repetitive. A warm drink might be shared, ale watered down for the children, or a thin broth sipped slowly. Hands were washed again, often as a kind of ritual, and prayers were whispered. Children were told to keep their heads down, to avoid wandering thoughts, and to mind the saints and spirits. Bedtime was not marked by a precise hour, but by fatigue and fading light. Yet before sleep, there was often time for stories. These were not the bright tales of knights and dragons that would later fill printed books, but old folk stories passed from mouth to mouth, altered slightly with each telling. Ghosts were frequent guests in these tales. Pale ladies who wandered forests, strange lights seen near graveyards, whispering winds that carried voices of the lost. For children in the plague years, fear was not an occasional feeling. It was part of furniture. They were used to seeing adults weep or argue in hushed tones, used to neighbors disappearing, used to the scent of herbs bundled near doorways, meant to ward off sickness. Some wore charms, tiny crosses, animal bones, bits of dried flowers sewn into pouches, around their necks. The boundary between life and the unknown was thinner then, and children were far more aware of it than we might imagine. Still, even in fear, there was comfort in repetition. The same firelight, the same story, the same prayers murmured into the folds of woolen blankets, the same familiar creak of the wooden door, the same gentle command. Sleep now, and don't rise too early. As the night deepened and the wind sighed outside, children slept curled together like little mice. Dreams came softly, of games, of food, of sunlit fields where no sickness walked. Outside, the village dozed beneath the stars, wrapped in shadows and silence. In the distance, a dog barked once. A shutter banged gently in the breeze. And then nothing. Now, let us turn the page and shift our gaze, not toward monarchs or generals, but toward one small figure, faintly glimpsed in the fading parchment of time. Her name was Alice, a child who lived not in legend, but in the gentle obscurity of a church record, a scribbled line in a village roll, a half-faded entry that simply read, Alice, daughter of Thomas the Carter, passed in the year of pestilence. From that one quiet note, we can imagine her, Alice, likely no older than 10, lived in a northern English village not unlike the one we visited already. Her father, a carter, drove a wooden cart pulled by a tired mule, hauling sacks of barley, bundles of firewood, the occasional cask of ale. He was known to the village, not important, but familiar. Alice's world would have been a small one, defined by the narrow dirt path from her door to the church, the edge of the woods where she wasn't supposed to go, and the neighboring homes where friends once lived. Her hands would have been roughened by work, her knees scraped, her eyes wide and weary. She might have worn a dress made from undyed wool, patched at the elbows and hem, tied at the waist with a bit of cord. Her shoes, if she had them, were handed down, hard leather, stiff and uncomfortable, but she likely went barefoot in summer, her toes dusty from the village road, her heels stained green from wild grasses. We do not know her favorite food. We do not know her voice, but we might guess that she liked to chase chickens, that she sang softly when no one was listening, that she listened more than she spoke. And we know that she lived during the hardest year, the year when carts no longer hauled goods, but something heavier, the year when her father might have returned home, quiet and pale, when doors were left unopened, when priests walked with cloth over their faces and refused to enter homes. Alice would have noticed. Children always notice. And yet, in the face of it all, she remained a child. She likely still sought sunlight, still watched the clouds, still whispered questions to herself when no one could answer. Her life is unrecorded in most history books. There are no grand tapestries of Alice, no portraits, no scrolls bearing her name. But still, her presence lingers in the soft margins of an ancient register, in the silent stories of every forgotten child of the plague years. And so tonight, we remember her, not with fanfare, but with quiet. There came a day, clouded as many were, when the rhythm of the village changed, and Alice noticed first not with her eyes, but with her ears. The church bell did not ring. Every morning, its sound floated over the rooftops like a kind of promise. It rang for matins. It rang for mass. It rang when the baker's oven opened and when the market was ready. But that morning it did not ring, and Alice paused across the bread in her hand and listened to the silence. Her father had already left, cart creaking slowly down the path. Her mother moved with slower steps that day, distracted. The hearth had barely been stoked. Even the chicken somehow seemed subdued. Something was off. It was not yet a world of explanation. Alice didn't know about incubation periods or contagion. She didn't know the Latin prayers spoken over the sick. But she didn't know her neighbor hadn't come outside that morning. And the smith's apprentice hadn't shouted hello. And the baker's wife hadn't thrown open her shutters to dust her mats. And so she waited. Children in plagued villages did not always understand, but they often sensed. They felt it in the way adults avoided touch. In the new rules spoken in whispers: don't share cups. Don't go near the well after dark. Don't talk to strangers. Don't. Alice stayed inside that day. She sat near the hearth and combed the straw from the rush floor into neat lines with a carved stick. She hummed to herself. She stared at the flicker of the candle. She watched dust dance in the air like tiny spirits. Later that evening, a priest passed by the window, robes gray with dust, a scarf wrapped around his mouth. He did not stop. Alice pressed her fingers to the glass and looked out. But her mother called her back before she could ask a question. The church bell did not ring again for 3 days. When it did, it rang not in celebration, but in mourning, a slow single tone, over and over. Alice sat very still. No one told her who had died, but she noticed the door across the road stayed shut. The candle in that window never lit again. After that, she wore a bit of rosemary tied in her tunic. She wasn't sure why, only that her mother said it was good. The scent made her nose itch, but she didn't complain. She watched her father burn herbs in the hearth, murmuring words he didn't usually say aloud. She watched her mother whisper to Virgin as she rubbed vinegar on the windowsill. Alice didn't cry. There wasn't one moment that demanded tears, just a string of quiet, strange days, until eventually they didn't feel strange anymore. The village kept changing, but slowly, so slowly that it was easy not to notice. One less face each week, one less voice, one less laugh, and Alice, still a child, folded it all away into her quiet heart. As the weeks passed, the days blurred together like pages left out in the rain. Edges softened, details faded, ink bleeding into memory. There is no record of what became of Alice beyond that single, somber note in the village ledger. No tale of a miraculous escape. No heroic defiance. No tragic poem written in her name. Like so many children of her time, her story dissolved into the stillness of history, absorbed by the earth she walked and the walls that once sheltered her. And yet in that silence, there is something more enduring than grief, the gentle persistence of memory. Imagine, for a moment, her mother brushing Alice's hair near the hearth one last time, her fingers slow and tired. Imagine Alice sleeping, curled beside her little brother, unaware of how brief her story would be. Imagine the morning when her father rose to stoke the fire and paused, because something was different, something absent, something missing from the air. And then, just as quietly, life would have continued around her absence. Children disappeared often in that year, sometimes taken by fever and night, sometimes sent to live with distant kin, sometimes simply no longer there. But grief in the 14th century was not always loud. Often it was quiet, a closed window, a bowl not set out, a pair of shoes left in the corner that no one moved for weeks. In time, her name may have been spoken less, first in whispers, then only in memory. The echo of a laugh, the way she tied her apron, the half song she used to hum while sweeping, and then nothing. The earth reclaims everything eventually, but memory lingers, fragile, yes, but stubborn, just enough for a name to survive in the ink of a church record. Alice, daughter of Thomas the Carter. Tonight, as you drift gently into sleep, her name returns for a while, softly, without demand, not with sadness, but with stillness, because even in a world of shadows and sorrow, there were children, and they lived and they laughed and they mattered, even when the world forgot. Children, even in plague-shadowed times, saw the world not just as it was, but as it might be. Their imaginations filled the gaps left by uncertain explanations. In a world where death came without clear reason, where disease seemed to move like smoke or shadow, children constructed meaning in their own quiet, peculiar ways. To an adult, the world might have been a trial of survival, but to a child, it was filled with invisible rules, hidden beings, and whispered rituals passed between peers. Children's beliefs were part inherited, part invented, and entirely earnest. They believed that certain rhymes, if said properly in the right order and with the correct number of steps taken in rhythm, could keep sickness away. They believed that holding your breath past a certain tree meant safety, that a frog hidden under a stone near the stream might protect your dreams. Some children tied scraps of cloth to tree branches, tokens for spirits. Some buried buttons in the earth as offerings. These rituals weren't taught by adults. They were passed child to child, as serious and sacred as any formal prayer. In some villages, archaeologists have uncovered curious items in children's graves from this era. Crudely shaped amulets, tiny dolls of rags, little pouches of herbs and pebbles. These weren't always placed by grieving parents. They may have been carried by the child, clutched tightly, believed in. To them, these objects weren't trinkets. They were tools, weapons, in their own quiet way, against the darkness. Ghost stories were popular too, not the grand gothic tales we know today, but simpler ones, of glowing eyes in the barn rafters, of a girl who could speak to cats, of the plague taking the form of a woman in a black veil, walking slowly between the homes each night. These tales were shared in whispers at twilight, when chores were done and the grown-ups were distracted, and always there was the idea that the world was watching. Children left little tokens for unseen things, a stone balanced on a doorstep, a bent nail hidden behind a tree, a bundle of lavender tied to a chicken's leg. If the item remained in place come morning, it meant they were safe. If it moved, they'd make another. In this way, belief and fear, mystery and imagination blurred into daily life. The line between the sacred and the playful was faint. One child's superstition might become another's tradition, and all of it stitched a kind of comfort over the creeping fear of the unknown. Even now, centuries later, we can see echoes of those beliefs, etched into the artifacts found buried in soil, or remembered faintly in nursery rhymes that seemed strange when heard too closely. It was a world full of shadows, but the children found ways to explain the dark, their own way. In the dim glow of the medieval hearth, before sleep, mothers and elder siblings often lulled younger children with songs. Simple verses that dance on the edge of memory and myth. Some were meant to teach. Others were meant to soothe. A few carried secrets. The nursery rhymes of the 14th century weren't always sweet. Some were strange. Some bordered on the eerie. Their lines were full of coded warnings, half-remembered rituals, and references to events so old that even the singers no longer knew their meaning. A popular one went something like, "In comes the fog, under the door, hide your face, speak no more. When the bell tolls thrice, lie still in bed, else the black wind takes your head." To adult ears today, such verses sound unsettling, but to a medieval child, these were as natural as rain. They were part of the world's rhythm, a kind of magic spoken aloud. Children believed wholeheartedly that such rhymes held power. To speak them wrong was to invite misfortune. To forget a line meant trouble. Others were more playful. Rhymes for choosing who would be in a game, verses to accompany clapping games or pebble counting. But even these often carried echoes of a harder world. Mentions of fire, illness, angels, and bones. Gentle warnings in lilting tones. Archaeological finds, fragments of scratched notes, marginalia in prayer books, suggest that some rhymes were even written down, scrawled next to serious texts. It's likely that a scribe's child, or perhaps a young apprentice, had idly copied a favorite chant in the margins of a psalter while no one was watching. And alongside rhymes came charms. Spoken lines meant to heal or protect. For children, these weren't superstitions. They were as real as rain. 3 white hairs and a pinch of bread. Tuck them tight beneath your head. Or, step not on the churchyard stone, lest you walk to bed alone. These chants were passed by children, memorized, traded, and modified. One might rhyme slightly differently from village to village, and yet, across time, the pattern held. The belief that words, simple, rhythmic, whispered, had power, that memory was a kind of spell. These songs and chants, though few were recorded, likely survived in oral tradition for generations, changing shape, shifting tone, until they became the lullabies and riddles we now know. Some may still echo in playgrounds, though their origins lie in a world shaped by fear, by belief, and by the deep need for comfort in the face of the unknown. A world where, for a child, the right rhyme could be a shield, a song a spell, a whisper of forgotten magic. Centuries later, long after the names were forgotten and the songs had faded, the earth began to give things back. Archaeologists, digging quietly beneath old village sites and monastic graveyards, began to uncover tiny clues, objects too ordinary for official record, yet too deliberate to be discarded by chance. These were not coins or crowns or relics of kings. They were smaller, humbler, and profoundly human. In one child's grave, a carved wooden animal, likely a dog, was found resting at the foot of the skeleton, smooth from handling, its edges worn but still recognizable. In another, a tightly bundled pouch, stitched with coarse thread, held dried herbs, rosemary, sage, and a small pebble marked with a faint scratch, possibly a symbol, perhaps just a child's drawing. Scholars now believe these were not burial gifts in a formal sense. Rather, they were comfort objects, grave tokens, left by parents or perhaps clutched by the child themselves when they took ill. Tiny defenses against the darkness, meaningful not in value, but in memory. Some graves bore marks not easily explained. Stones carefully placed over small chests, or circles drawn in ash beneath the bones. There were whispers, even among the cautious, that these might have been apotropaic symbols, wards against restless spirits, or signs of protective charm. Superstition met sorrow at every turn. In a few locations, flat stones were found etched with simplistic faces, 2 dots and a crooked smile, likely drawn by children themselves. Whether these were tokens left for lost siblings, or simply toys brought into the grave by those too young to understand, we cannot say for certain. But they speak volumes in their silence. And sometimes, amid the unearthed debris of medieval homes, archaeologists find bones, not human, but small animal remains, neatly arranged in lines beneath floorboards or nestled between wall beams. Some believe these were part of old protective rituals. Others think they may have been a child's collection, bits of the natural world gathered with purpose. Either way, they reveal something of the emotional life of the forgotten young. The archaeology of children is always delicate. Their presence in the historical record is faint, often incidental. But these traces, buttons, charms, simple carvings, offer something richer than dates or royal names ever could. They offer feeling. They show us fear, but also creativity. Sorrow, but also care. They show that even in an age of terror, children still played, believed, loved, and left behind tiny echoes of themselves in a world they once wandered. The earth, in time, softens all things. But some stories refuse to vanish. They wait beneath the surface, patiently, for the gentle touch of a trowel, for a pair of quiet eyes, for remembrance. Not all children lived in humble cottages, barefoot and bruised from play. Some were born into stone, into castles, manor houses, and great walled estates. They wore linen shifts beneath woolen cloaks, ate from pewter or silver, and were taught their letters by tutors with tired eyes and careful voices. And yet, even the highest walls could not keep the Black Death at bay. Within the cool halls of noble homes, daily life for children was marked by ceremony. They rose with the sun, not to fetch water, but to recite prayers and receive lessons in Latin, manners, and arithmetic. Boys were trained to become knights, clerics, or lords. Girls were groomed to manage households, estates, and if lucky, futures of careful marriages. Their toys were different. Ivory dice, jointed dolls, small carved horses. Some had books, though they were few and precious. Their world was one of order, lineage, and quiet supervision. And yet, the air still shifted when the plague arrived. For all their power, noble families feared death just as keenly. They fled cities for countryside retreats, locked themselves inside their great homes, and burned perfumed woods to cleanse the air. Servants wore amulets. Chaplains prayed hourly. Doors were barred, and the children watched. They noticed when a maid disappeared and wasn't spoken of again, when the cook no longer sang, when the tutor's voice faltered. They were told to wash their hands with wine, to avoid the lower halls, to hold their breath near strangers. Some were sent away, to distant relatives, monasteries, or safe country manors. Others were kept inside, where the windows were shuttered even in daylight, and the once lively household grew dim and anxious. Their experience of the plague was different, yes, but not untouched. One noble girl, known only through a letter found centuries later, wrote to her cousin, "They do not let me walk the halls, for fear. The chapel bell does not sound. Mother prays often, and we do not sing at lessons. I am made to wear a rosemary tie to my wrist. I think of your garden. I dream of geese." Even privilege could not grant understanding. The children of the elite, like their peasant counterparts, lived with half answers, strange rules, and watchful adults. The difference was only in scale. The rooms larger, the silences more formal. Behind every stone wall was a child wondering why everything had changed.